Knew something had shifted the moment my partner's mother offered me the dish towel instead of a seat. Not dramatically, not with any obvious intent. She just handed it to me the way you hand something to someone who works there, and then turned back to finish setting the table. And I took it. I dried a pot. I didn't say a word. That moment happened near the beginning of the evening. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of several weeks after. But I need you to understand that one small gesture, a dish towel, not a chair, told me everything I needed to know about how they saw me. Before I had said 10 words. Before I had finished my coat off. I should back up. My name is Theo, and I've worked as a cardiac surgeon at a hospital in Toronto for the past 4 years. Before that, residency in Vancouver. Before that, med school at McGill. I have spent most of my adult life in hospitals, in scrubs, in a world where your last name gets said a certain way, where people move differently when you walk into a room. I'm 32. I don't look like most people's image of a cardiac surgeon. I'm the daughter of Filipino immigrants who came to Canada in the 90s with very little and built something quiet and steady in Scarborough. I grew up in a semi-detached house on a street where everyone kept their front steps swept. My parents never talked about money or status. They talked about effort. They talked about showing up. When I met my partner, I was wearing jeans and a rain jacket, standing outside a coffee shop on Queen Street West, arguing with my phone because the map app had sent me to the wrong address. He laughed before he introduced himself. His name is Ben, and he worked in urban planning for the city. We talked for 2 hours that first afternoon. He never asked what I did. I never volunteered it. By the 3rd date, he knew I worked in medicine. By the 6th, he knew I was a surgeon. But I had never said the word cardiac. I had never explained what that actually meant in terms of what I did, what I earned, or where I stood in a hospital hierarchy. He didn't press. I didn't explain. We talked about other things, his family's place in New Brunswick, my mother's garden in Scarborough, what we were both reading, the kind of conversations that made time disappear. When he proposed, just over 2 years in, I was happy. Not surprised exactly, but genuinely happy. And when he said his parents wanted to meet me, I said yes immediately. He told me they were straightforward people. His father had worked in construction for 30 years. His mother had run a daycare out of their home until it closed. They lived in a town about 2 hours outside of Fredericton, the kind of place where you wave at people you don't know and everyone follows hockey like it's religion. I didn't hesitate. I wanted to meet them, and I admit I was a little curious. Not in a strategic way, just quietly curious about what they would be like before they knew anything about me. We drove out on a Friday evening in October. The trees were doing that thing they do in New Brunswick in the fall, that violent, gorgeous display of orange and red that makes you feel like you're driving through something that can't possibly be real. Ben talked most of the way. He told me his father was funny once you got past the quiet. His mother made a blueberry grunt that would change my life. I laughed. I held his hand across the gear shift. His parents' house was a 2-story with cedar siding and a wraparound porch. A truck in the driveway. A stack of split wood along the side of the house. Neat and solid, the kind of house that has been lived in for decades without apology. His mother opened the door before we knocked. Warm smile, quick hands, the kind of woman who fills a room by moving through it efficiently. She hugged Ben long and then turned to me. "Nice to meet you," she said. "Come on in, don't let the cold in." His father was in the kitchen. Big man, gray at the temples, handshake like a door closing. He looked me over once, not unkindly, just assessing the way people do when they're deciding where someone fits. "So, Ben says you're in medicine," he said. "Yes," I said. "Receptionist?" His mother called from the stove. I paused. "Just for a second." "No," I said. "I work with patients directly." She turned and smiled. "Oh, like a nurse. That's wonderful. We need more nurses." I smiled back. I didn't correct her. That was the first moment. There were others. At dinner, his mother asked if the hospital work was stressful. I said it could be. She nodded and said her niece was a dental hygienist and found it quite demanding. I agreed that healthcare in general was demanding. His father talked about a neighbor whose son had gone into nursing and how that was good, steady work, not like trades where your knees give out by 50. Nobody asked follow-up questions about my work. Nobody seemed particularly curious. I was Ben's girlfriend from Toronto, probably worked in a clinic somewhere, probably made decent money for a young woman, probably had student loans. When his mother started clearing the dishes, she handed me a cloth without asking and pointed to the stovetop. "Could you wipe that down, dear? We're out of paper towel." I wiped down the stovetop. Ben was in the other room with his father watching the end of the game. I could hear them laughing about something. I stood in his parents' kitchen with a dishcloth, cleaning a burner, and I thought about the operating room I had been in at 6:30 that morning, the chest I had opened, the decision I had made that had kept a 60-year-old grandfather alive to see his granddaughter born in the spring. I wasn't angry. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something quieter and more clarifying. I was seeing something clearly that I had only ever theorized about. His mother came back in and started wrapping leftovers. She asked me if I planned to keep working after we got married. I said I couldn't imagine not working. She nodded, a little uncertain. "Of course," she said. "But Ben does well enough. You wouldn't have to." I thanked her for saying that. I meant it as a genuine acknowledgement of her intention. She was being generous by her own definition of generosity. Later, sitting in the living room, his father asked me directly where I worked. I told him the name of the hospital. He nodded slowly. "Good hospital. My brother had a procedure there a while back." I asked what kind. "Heart," he said. "Bypass." And I said, "That's what I do." The room paused. Not dramatically. The television was still on. But I felt his father's attention change. A small physical adjustment, like someone turning up the volume on something they weren't sure they had heard correctly. "I'm a cardiac surgeon," I said. His mother set down her mug. His father looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "A cardiac surgeon, yes." He was quiet. Then, quietly, "Ben, come in here." Ben came in from the kitchen holding a can of ginger ale, and his father just pointed at me. "Tell him what you just said." I smiled. "I'm a cardiac surgeon. I work in cardiac surgery at the hospital." Ben looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated. Like he was recalibrating something in his mind and wasn't sure yet what the new number was. "You never actually said that," he said finally. "You never asked," I said. That wasn't an accusation, it was true. He had never asked what kind of surgeon. I had never said. We had both moved around the edges of it, comfortable in the shape we'd made together. His father was the one who finally spoke. He cleared his throat once. "That's," he said, and then he stopped. "That's a serious job." "Yes," I said, "it is." The rest of the evening shifted in a way I'd come to expect and had been quietly dreading. His mother brought out a second dessert she had been saving. She asked me twice if I wanted tea. His father, who had spent most of dinner talking about deductibles and housing prices in rural New Brunswick, now asked me carefully considered questions about hospital administration, as if I were someone to be treated with attention. They were trying. I could see that, and the effort itself was kind. But I sat in that living room and thought about the dish towel, the stovetop, the assumption about student loans, the question about whether I would keep working after marriage. None of it had been cruel, but all of it had been a version of me they had decided on before I arrived, and now they were quietly trying to replace that version with a new one. That replacement was harder to sit with than the original assumption. On the drive back to the B&B we were staying at, Ben didn't say much for the first few minutes. The highway was dark and the trees on either side had lost their color in the headlights. "Why didn't you just tell them?" he asked eventually. "Tell them what?" "That you were a cardiac surgeon." From the beginning, I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I wanted to see who they were first," I said, "before they knew." He was quiet for a moment. "And?" I looked out the window. "They're exactly who they seem to be," I said. "That's not a bad thing." He didn't respond right away. I could tell he wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not. That night, lying awake in a room that smelled like cedar and old wood smoke, I thought about what I had actually come for. It wasn't to embarrass anyone. It wasn't to prove a point. I had spent enough years walking into rooms where my title changed everything, where nurses adjusted their posture, where patients suddenly became more cooperative, where colleagues in other departments found time to return calls they'd been ignoring, to be tired of it, exhausted by it. I had wanted, just once, to sit at a table and be treated simply as a person, not a position. What I hadn't accounted for was that seeing the alternative might be just as hard. The next morning at breakfast, his mother was warmer than she had been. She asked about my hours, about whether I had mentors, whether the field was welcoming to women. Real questions, the kind with curiosity behind them. I answered honestly. It was a better conversation than the one the night before, in some ways. But there was something constructed about it too. A carefulness that hadn't been there when she was asking if I'd wiped down the stovetop. Ben's father came in late, poured himself coffee, sat down at the table across from me. He looked like a man who had been thinking since the previous evening. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead, I said. How does a person get to where you are? He asked it plainly without performance, like someone who genuinely didn't know and wanted to. I told him, McGill, residency, fellowship, 7 years of training after med school. The statistics about how few women were in the field when I started, the ones that hadn't shifted as much as they should have. He listened without interrupting, which surprised me. When I finished, he said, I made assumptions about you. I know, I said. He nodded once, a slow motion, like a door being opened carefully. I'm not proud of that. I told him I understood. And I meant it. I didn't say it to absolve him. I said it because it was true. I had grown up watching my mother get talked over at parent-teacher nights because of her accent. I had seen how assumptions operated. I knew it wasn't always malice. That didn't make it harmless. But it was different from malice. That afternoon, Ben and I walked along a trail near the river by himself. The sky was the particular gray you only see in the Maritimes in October. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and he kept glancing at me sideways. I want to ask you the same thing my dad was going to ask last night, he said finally. What's that? He stopped walking. Are you happy with me? I stopped too. I looked at him. Yes, I said, I am. He turned to face me. But would you still be, if I'd known from the start? I understood what he was really asking. Would I have chosen him differently if he'd been adjusting to the information from the beginning? I chose you because of a coffee shop on Queen Street, I said. Because you laughed first. Because you argued about urban density for 45 minutes without once making me feel like my opinion was a courtesy. That's not rank dependent. He smiled, but it was a careful smile. I just feel like I've been walking around next to someone I didn't fully know. I looked at him. You knew me. You just didn't know my title. There's a difference, he said. A very important one, I agreed. We walked a while longer. The river was high and fast from autumn rain. Ben was quiet in the way he got quiet when he was genuinely thinking rather than performing thought. I appreciated that about him. He didn't rush to a conclusion. Back in Toronto, the weeks that followed were strange. Ben's parents sent a card, an actual card, Canada Post, handwritten, thanking me for the visit and saying they hoped to see me again at Christmas. His mother had included a recipe for the blueberry grunt, a full page, handwritten, with notes in the margins. Ben held it out to me like it was evidence of something. She's never done that, he said. Written out a recipe. I read the card carefully. It was genuine. I could tell from the crossings out, the small corrections, the way it didn't sound like someone performing warmth but like someone trying to communicate it. And yet I found myself setting it on the kitchen counter and standing there for a long moment. Before I was a cardiac surgeon, I had been Ben's girlfriend from Toronto. And his mother had handed me a dish towel and asked me to clean the stovetop. Now, I was the woman who opened chests, and she was sending handwritten recipes and her good cardstock. Nothing about me had changed. Everything about her information had. I called my own mother that evening. She asked how the visit had gone. I told her the short version. Lovely family, good trip, beautiful part of the country. She asked if his parents were kind. I thought about the dish towel. I thought about the blueberry grunt recipe. I thought about his father's face in the kitchen doorway when he'd said, "That's a serious job. They're learning to be," I said. My mother laughed, the kind of laugh that meant she understood something I hadn't said. She told me about a time before I was born when she had worked as a bookkeeper in Mississauga, and her boss had asked her to refill the office coffee before a meeting in front of a boardroom full of people. She hadn't said anything then either. She'd picked up the carafe and done it, but I remembered what that felt like, she said. I know, I said. The next real thing happened about 3 weeks later. Ben invited me to his cousin's birthday party in Oshawa. Casual, backyard, a mix of family and friends. I wore a sweater and jeans. Ben introduced me as his fiancé, nothing more. The party was easy and warm. Kids running around the yard. Someone had a Bluetooth speaker playing a mix that kept sliding between country and top 40 in a way that somehow worked. I had a beer and talked to various people, and at some point someone asked me what I did. I work at a hospital, I said. Oh, nice, the woman said. Are you an admin? I work with patients, I said. She smiled. That's great. They really need people who care. She moved on to refill her drink. Ben caught my eye from across the yard. He had heard the whole exchange. His expression was different than it would have been a month earlier. He looked like someone who had learned to see something that had always been there. Later, he came over and stood beside me. They didn't ask your last name, he said quietly. No, I said. He handed me a fresh drink. How often does that happen? I considered the question. Almost every time someone doesn't already know, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I think I've been that person, he said. Before I knew. I looked at him. You probably have, I said. We all have, he nodded slowly. That's not a comfortable thing to hear, no, I said, but it's an honest one. Over the next few weeks, Ben changed in small ways that mattered more than large ones. He started to notice things I had stopped pointing out, because pointing them out had started to feel like teaching a class I hadn't agreed to teach. He noticed when we went to a dinner party and someone talked over me until the host mentioned my work. He noticed when a colleague of his referred to me as Ben's girlfriend, the doctor, instead of just my name. He didn't make a scene, he just came home and said, I saw it tonight, and that was enough. One evening in November, we were sitting in my kitchen. I had just finished a 6-hour case and was drinking soup directly from a mug because I hadn't had time to find a bowl. He was reading something on his laptop. It was quiet and domestic and ordinary, the kind of evening I had wanted for a long time without being able to name it. You know, he said without looking up, my parents asked me something last week. I waited. They asked if I thought I was good enough for you. I looked at him. He closed the laptop, and I told them the question was wrong. I asked him what he'd said instead. He said, I told them I was trying to be the kind of person who was right for her. That good enough was for job interviews. I set down the mug. That's a better answer than I expected. He smiled. I've been thinking about it for weeks. The thing I couldn't have predicted before any of this happened was that the most important reveal of the whole experience wasn't the one in his parents' living room. It was smaller than that. It happened 2 months later, at Christmas, back in New Brunswick. Ben's father met me at the door. He took my coat. He called me by my first name, not dear, not Ben's fiancé, not the surgeon, just Theo. And when his mother came in from the kitchen, she didn't hand me anything to do. She sat me down and put a cup of tea in front of me and asked how the drive had been. Small things. I know that. But I have spent enough years learning to read rooms to know that the small things are the only honest metric. Over the holiday, his father and I talked about his brother's bypass, the surgery, the recovery, what life looked like after. He asked real questions. Not interview questions, the way he had after the reveal at Thanksgiving. Just the questions of someone who has been through something and wants to understand it better. I answered the way I answer my patients' families. Plainly, without jargon, without performing competence. At one point he said, you must have had a moment when you weren't sure you wanted this for your life. I thought about it. There was a point in residency, I said. When I wasn't sure I could keep up the pace, he nodded. But you did. I had help, I said, people who showed up for me. He was quiet for a moment. Then my son's lucky. I said, I think I am too. At the Christmas dinner, Ben's father gave a small toast. He was not a man accustomed to speeches. You could tell by the way he held his glass slightly too tightly. He thanked everyone for coming and then said something I didn't expect. He said he had recently learned something at his age that he hadn't thought he needed to learn. That the way he treated people before he knew who they were said a lot more about him than the way he treated them after. And that he was trying to do better. He didn't look at me when he said it. Which was the right instinct. Ben squeezed my hand under the table. Later, washing dishes with his mother, this time side by side, as an equal activity rather than an assignment, she said something that stayed with me. I was embarrassed, she said, when I found out. Not because of what I didn't know. Because of how I acted on what I thought I knew. I handed her a rinse bowl. I told her I understood that it takes honesty to feel embarrassed. She looked at me sideways. You're going to be an interesting person to have in this family. I smiled. I hope so. Driving back to Toronto in the new year, Ben and I were mostly quiet. The Trans-Canada stretched out flat and bright with snow on either side. The sun was low and the light was that clean winter white that makes everything look new. He asked me, somewhere past Rivière-du-Loup, if I had any regrets about how the whole thing had unfolded. I thought about it carefully. No, I said, not really. But I learned something I hadn't expected. What's that? I told him I thought the hard part would be being treated like nobody. And it was, in its own way. But the harder part was watching what happened after. Seeing how quickly the treatment changed, and realizing that what had changed was only their information, not their instincts. Not yet. He let that sit for a while. Then, do you think they'll get there? I looked out at the highway. Your dad got there faster than most people, I said. Your mother is working on it. The fact that they're working on it at all is not nothing. Ben nodded. And us? I looked at him. I think we're figuring out how to stand next to each other, I said. Not one in front and one behind. Just next to. He reached over and held my hand. That's all I want, he said. That was enough. For that stretch of highway, with the January light coming in flat through the windshield and the country wide and cold on either side of us, it was enough. I have thought about that dish towel more than I have thought about almost anything else from those months. Not with bitterness. More like you think about a photograph that captures something true. It was offered without any awareness that it was an act of assumption. That's what made it so honest. We live in a country that talks a lot about fairness, about not judging, about the value of every person. And most of us believe we live by those values. We are earnest about it. But belief is the easy part. The harder thing is noticing the reflexive moment before belief has a chance to arrive. The moment when your hands move before your mind catches up. The moment when you hand someone the dish towel instead of the chair. I'm not exceptional because of my title. I was the same person before they knew and after. The difference was their lens, not me. And the reason I'm still with Ben, the reason his family is now mine, the reason I drove to New Brunswick in October and again at Christmas and will again in the summer, is not because they became perfect. It's because when they saw something in themselves they didn't recognize and didn't like, they chose to sit with it rather than explain it away. That's not small. In my experience, that's one of the rarest things there is. I still think about that dish towel sometimes, not with anger. I want to be clear about that. More the way you think about something that told you the truth before anyone had to say a word. What happened over those months with Ben's family taught me something I hadn't expected to learn, because I thought I already knew it. I thought I understood how assumptions worked. I had watched them operate my whole life, on my mother, on people I trained alongside, on patients who got less attention in a waiting room before someone caught the error. I thought I had processed it. What I hadn't done was sit still inside it quietly and let it show me exactly what it was. Ben's parents weren't bad people. That matters. They were people who had spent their lives measuring worth through visible, legible effort, through work you could see with your hands, outcomes you could point to, a definition of contribution that had served their generation reasonably well. When they looked at me and saw a young woman from Toronto who worked somewhere in a hospital, they slotted me into the category that fit. Politely, without cruelty, without any awareness that they were doing it at all. That's the part I keep returning to. Not the assumptions themselves, but the automaticity of them. How little space there was between a perception and the response. The dish towel was in my hands before a single thought had been completed. What changed them wasn't the information about my title. Not really. What changed them, slowly, imperfectly, genuinely, was the discomfort of seeing their own reflex clearly and choosing to examine it rather than defend it. Ben's father sitting in that kitchen the morning after, saying I didn't like the man I saw in myself that night, that took something. A kind of honesty with yourself that doesn't come easily and doesn't arrive without effort. That's what I mean when I think about character as something you build rather than something you have. You don't get it by default. You get it by sitting with the uncomfortable version of yourself and deciding to do differently. Ben took longer. He had to learn to see a thing that had always been invisible to him, the small constant friction of moving through a world that regularly forgets to ask your name. He didn't get there through a single conversation. He got there by paying attention, again and again, in ordinary moments that didn't announce themselves as important. That kind of attention is its own form of intelligence. Not the kind measured by credentials, but the kind that requires you to stay curious about someone else's experience, even when it asks something of you. And me. I had spent years hiding my title to protect myself from being reduced to it. What I learned, eventually, was that there was a cost to that too. Not because hiding was wrong, But because I'd confused protection with distance, I'd kept people at arm's length from something true about me, and then wondered why some of them didn't fully see me. The three of us, Ben, his father, and I, all had something to figure out. None of it was fast, none of it was clean. But the willingness to stay in that discomfort rather than step back from it, to keep showing up to the kitchen, to the trail, to the drive home, that was the whole thing. That was what made it worth it. I think that's the only honest measure of any relationship in the end. Not how people treat you when they're impressed, how they treat you when they think there's nothing to be impressed by, and what they do when they realize they were wrong.